Hi everybody, Levi Clay here, and in today's video, a little bit more of an improvised video essay in celebration of the release of my new book, 100 Guitar Licks of the 1960s. I wanted to make a case for why the 1960s is probably the most important, if not the most interesting, decade in music history. Now, of course, this video is extremely subjective, but I'm going to do my best to make a case for the 1960s. And I should be clear, the 1960s isn't my personal favourite decade of music. Not a chance. I'm definitely, kind of 70s and 80s is definitely more my area of passion. But it's impossible to deny how important the 1960s was, because of course, without the 1960s, we wouldn't have had the 1970s and the 1980s. Music is a constant form of evolution, and therefore the things that happen lead to other things. So we have to respect why things happened when they happened. And of course, that all comes down to culture and what's happening at any given time in society. And the 1960s was a particularly interesting decade when you really think about it. If you go a little bit before the 1960s, of course, 39 to 45, the world was pretty much fighting each other, which tends to result in art and music taking a bit of a back seat. So there's not all that much to really report culturally during that era. The 1950s, of course, we're definitely thinking of of sounds like rock and roll, the birth of that rock and roll sound, and that really kind of encapsulated that decade. But the 1960s was something a little bit different to that, because of course the 1960s took all of those rock and roll influences, all of those sounds, and that had this huge cultural explosion, the rise of the counterculture, social revolution, and of course the hippie movement, which was very anti-war, the protests about the Vietnam War. At the start of the 60s, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, there was so much happening during this era, and art was becoming something that people were interested in devoting time into. It was accepted that people were active in art. Poetry was very popular. Painting, art itself was very popular, and music, all of these things kind of went together. There was a massive rise in the West of the use of LSD and marijuana. And of course, this just created this fascinating melting pot of sounds. When you think of bands like the Grateful Dead, that band existed because of everything that was happening at the time. Now, of course, it's not just limited to the things that were happening on that scene. You also had the birth of soul music in the 1960s, which would go on to eventually morph and mutate into funk in the 70s. So that's an interesting thing. You had the British blues invasion, which is when, of course, all of those classic blues records of the early blues guys from America made their way over to the UK, and we started creating our own sounds. And you have, of course, bands like, ultimately bands that would become Cream. All of those sounds, just a fabulous kind of indicator of some of the things that were happening. Surf guitar became popular. If we look on the country scene, things are happening. If we look on literally everywhere, things are happening. If you look at the jazz scene, now Miles Davis released Kind of Blue in like 1959. So the 1960s on the jazz scene, that kind of cool jazz sound had really started to take over, that modal cool sound. And of course, in 1970, so right at the end of this decade, Miles would then release Bitches Brew, which I think we all consider to be kind of the birth of that rock fusion sound. But would that have happened if not for what happened in the 1960s? When you look at other things that happened in the 1960s, just from a cultural perspective, I think one of the most important social events that certainly happened, I can't really say in our lifetime, I wasn't here, but in recent history, is the civil rights movement in America. That's the 1960s. There was so much happening around equal rights in general, but of course, the civil rights movement among the black community was incredibly important in the 1960s, and again, just created this melting pot of people being very politically active. You had second wave feminism taking off. You ultimately, towards the end of the 60s, had the Stonewall riots, which resulted in lots of the gay rights protests that would happen. And on the art scene, of course, you've still got people like Salvador Dali and Andy Warhol active. So lots and lots of things are happening from a like a technological standpoint, there was the moon landings in the 1960s. And I should be really clear, everything I'm talking about here, these are all just the things that are happening in Western culture. But there's so much happening all over the world in the 1960s. You have the troubles in Northern Ireland kicking off over here in Europe, or there's social revolution happening in China with Mao at the time. The 60s is just a fascinating era, and I would highly, highly recommend that you take some time to look at just this incredible musical revolution that was happening at the time. So at its core, I do kind of talk about this in my book. I'm wanting to deliberately go out of my way to show you lots of artists that came from so many different backgrounds to create, you know, hugely different sounds. Because if it wasn't for all these things happening, you wouldn't have had Woodstock at the end of the 60s. And Woodstock is one of the most significant moments in music history, you know, in our, again, I say lifetime, I wasn't here, but you know what I mean, in recent memory. Woodstock, just incredible. If you really look at how big a deal Woodstock was and how many people turned up for Woodstock, it's just astonishing to think that that happened, and it happened at the perfect time. It's the end of a decade. The Summer of Love has happened. Like, it's all, people are trying to come together and say something, be very anti-war and do things. And that's, I wanted to do my best to kind of capture why all of these players helped to make that mark. So from the Jimi Hendrixes, and of course you can't do a book on the 1960s without talking about Jimi Hendrix, so there's definitely a chapter on Jimi Hendrix in there, and I think still, because of how significant he was during that period, he's always going to kind of top the list as the most important guitar player ever. Again, not my favourite, but you have to respect how important that was. You have other great blues guitar players during that era, like Eric Clapton or Peter Green. Actually, in the book, is probably my favourite of the blues artists. You've got the Beatles. How did I not mention the Beatles? The rise and popularity of pop music. As I mentioned, the surf guitar thing. So I've got some Dick Dale in the book. From a soul perspective, Curtis Mayfield and Steve Cropper, I'm covering those guys. Carlos Santana, Jeff Beck. It really is just a long list of incredible musical things that are happening. So whether or not you're interested in the book, I would encourage you to take a little bit more time to think about history and where the music that you listen to and the music that you love has come from. Because for me, you may not be on the same page on this, but as I say, that evolution of music, the history of things, I always find that fascinating. I've always found where we came from to be very, very interesting, because ultimately I think we can use where we came from as an indicator of maybe where things are going. So I would definitely encourage you to go and check out the 1960s, and let me know what you think about the 1960s in the comment section below, or if you think another decade in music was more important, and if so, why? I'm always happy to engage with you down there. So do that. And of course, if you do grab a copy of the book, link in the description, please do let me know how you get on with it and drop it a wee review on Amazon. It is a huge, huge help. Thank you so much for checking this video out. I'm looking forward to engaging with you in the comments on this one. And I mean, I think it's fair to say I've done a book on the 1960s, so a book on the 1970s is absolutely coming. And there's a lot of things that happen in the 70s. Things get a little bit more technically advanced. But I'm just going to leave you with this this closing thought. If you think things got technically advanced in the 70s and 80s, they absolutely did. But if you go and check out Alvin Lee playing I'm Going Home, sorry, on Woodstock, his playing on that, as far as I'm concerned, is like the birth of shred guitar. And without a shadow of a doubt, those are the hardest licks to play in the book. So yeah, 1960s, let me know what you think in that comment section below. Much love, and I will see you for another video soon. Goodbye.